Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on your notifications. Now today, I get to share with all of you a conversation that I had with licensed professional marriage and family therapist, Amber Wirth. She joined me to talk about how we can deal with the pressure that we face in our life. Now, whether that may be pressure at work, comparison as a parent, and more. Now, this is a two-part episode, and in the second half, we'll chat about how to help your kids deal with pressure. So this is part one of my conversation with Amber. Hi, Amber. Thanks for coming onto the podcast.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. So last time you were on, we had a great discussion about trauma. It was really informative and it was really helpful, and I loved our conversation, and I'm excited that now we get to talk again about something that I think a lot of people really struggle with. I think it's kind of an unavoidable thing that we all face at some point in our lives. Mm-hmm. Probably lots of people, maybe as they're driving or listening right now, they're like, oh yeah, as soon as they hear it, they're gonna be like, yep, that's something I'm probably facing in about 5 different ways right now. And that's pressure. How do we deal with pressure? And so maybe we could start off, Amber, would you mind just maybe defining pressure, how that might be a little bit different than when we talk about general stress or anxiety, if it is different?
Yeah. I think pressure in general can be talked about in many complex ways. It's like this umbrella term for, I think, many things that we experience. I sort of have it kind of in 2 different ways of, one general thing is I wrote down when we are expected to perform to a degree that challenges us in uncomfortable ways in our everyday lives. The very overall encompassing that feeling of needing to show up and needing to accomplish everything of our everyday lives, like getting up in the morning, making sure we're on time for school and work, and all that entails that. And I think with this comes a piece of anxiety with that given and perceived expectations.
Yeah. So I imagine that the way I at least my perception of it, right, is that there's kind of 2, there's either internal, right, where we're kind of putting that pressure on ourselves, that like you mentioned, I love that definition, that almost that expectation of performance. I think that's a really helpful way of framing it. I imagine there's an internal and an external form of that. Is there a way of discovering what that source is, and if it is internal versus external, and maybe how does that kind of shift how we view or might go about tackling and dealing with pressure?
Well, I think it's contextual to each of us, right? I mean, we are experiencing external and internal pressures based on our context of our culture, our societal expectations, our work environment, our religion, our work and school environment. There's this external sort of force that has given us sort of these parameters to have to show up and accomplish these things. Yeah. And so I think that subconsciously kind of just puts that inside of us, needing to have to do this. And I think that's where the internal piece comes of how do I meet that? And constantly always being stretched in those uncomfortable ways of needing to show up to the external ones.
Yeah. So are there any typical, you kind of mentioned a few of them, work, school, how important is it to kind of identify where you're feeling that pressure, in order to start handling it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the main key in all of this conversation is noticing ourselves and how
Mm.
we respond to those stressors that come from the pressures. You
Yeah.
know, the internal pressures lie within our personal context. Like that is important for we're the ones that we really strive in performing well.
Mm.
Those are the ones that are important to us, and so we kind of hone in on those specific ones, contextual to our needs and our desires and our like moral compass and where those lie. And so there's
Mm.
some, I think, some important ones that are really that we strive to show up well. And I think that the shame maybe and the disconnect comes from when we feel like we're not doing that.
Yeah. So you mentioned like, is there any, is that like a self-talk type of thing? Is that like, I am, like, is that like, oh, I'm telling myself I should be doing this thing. I should be doing that thing. Is that how some of the internal pressure kind of manifests? Is that what that looks like?
I think, yeah, like when you're kind of the question of like discovering the difference between the external ones and the internal ones is like, where am I feeling an obligation to perform way beyond my capacity?
Mm.
Um, and again, where is that? Obviously, like we're all gonna, you know, deal with stress in our own contextual ways. So, like the symptoms of feeling overwhelmed, feeling high anxiety, feeling exhausted, you know, all these like very normal things. We're all going to feel that when we're butting up against a lot of stress that is too much on our plate.
Yeah.
And so some of that stuff comes out sideways. Again, contextually to each of us and the way that comes out. I think noticing and discovering where they're coming out sideways and where I'm feeling a massive obligation for like this disconnect to have to perform to the things that I know maybe aren't really about me,
Mm.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I'm curious how much of that, like you mentioned, like almost this realization that it's beyond your capacity. I imagine for some people that might be like a challenging thing to even, I guess, think through. Like, oh, or it's like a self talk. Like, oh, this shouldn't be beyond my capacity. And I think we would all love to think that we have a limitless capacity and we can handle whatever. And it's like, and I think there's even sometimes a societal pressure to say you should be able to handle like this level when maybe it's just not within your capacity yet or ever.
Right. You're honing in on like the sense of shame, which
Yeah.
sometimes it's like really hard to identify that because it's a really murky feeling. It's a really dark feeling that kind of encompasses this sense of anxiety and depression and fear of feeling I'm not good enough, which is huge because it's not if I have shame, it's when I have shame where that shows up. And you're right. It's like when you're noticing I should be doing better. I should be doing this better. I shouldn't be doing this. I should. And that's the shoulding is inducing that sense of shame, that disconnect of ourselves, that lack of compassion that we tend to kind of put that on ourselves.
Yeah, I had someone once say the things we will say to ourselves are often worse than we would ever say to anybody else. And that line has always like struck with me in a really powerful way. And I think it really hits on that kind of shame pressure component.
Yeah. Yeah. And that also comes for this sort of needing to compare to the world. Like you're saying, like the societal obligations of seeing sort of like this unrealistic view of everybody's performing really well and I'm not.
Yeah.
We also obviously not see like what they're dealing with, you know, that is just a very perceived notion.
Yeah. So you mentioned the shame. Is there any like when you think through someone's talking to you about the pressures that they're facing and maybe it's like an excessive amount, they're not I don't want to say they're not handling it well because I think that maybe that's accurate. They're handling it and it's beyond their capacity and they're struggling to deal with it in a healthy way. Maybe how does that kind of show up in different mental health areas? Because I think that in some capacity, pressure is typically like, and I could be wrong here, right? So you feel free to, you're the expert, you feel free to correct me on this. But it almost feels like the concept of pressure is almost like a something that kind of affects the other mental health things that people will search or look up or try to discover without maybe necessarily realizing that pressure is a main component too.
Yeah. Again, like I think pressure is the sort of arching unit that maybe exposes some of our symptoms. And I think when it comes to the point where we're talking about general stress, of course, is going to make us feel anxious, hypertension, this and that, like everyday sort of fluctuations on our body.
Yeah.
And then there's like the thing that needs to be monitored is, where am I not functioning? And that's the thing that I sort of hone in on with my clients is, if it starts to impact and inhibits your everyday functioning, this is when it becomes an issue. This is where like the higher level of care is possibly needed, where maybe you need more extra care. Maybe you need to have some space and boundaries that need to be implemented on how that means to really self-care well. So to me, it's understanding where you're, again, everyday functioning. So if you're not getting up for work in the morning, if you're not able to take a shower, if you're not showing up for work anymore, if you're not, if your symptoms are coming out sideways in those ways.
Yeah. Could that manifest in things like, I don't know what the right word is, but like too extreme of an emotional response. So maybe like anger or yelling, like something like that. Is that where those types of things might show up as well?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, like when we're butting up against a lot of stress, we have like chronic stress hormones that sort of induce us to kind of sort of react in a way that we typically wouldn't. And so again, that can kind of induce a sense of shame, like, oh my God, I'm failing. I can't even get to work. I'm yelling at my kids. I'm yelling at my wife. I'm yelling at whatever. This doesn't feel me.
Yeah.
Like I have this disconnect from myself, disconnect from others. Some people really just kind of like disconnect from the world. And that's sort of another scary thing too, of where am I hiding and not wanting to show up when I typically would.
And show up meaning like at an event, show up meaning like emotionally, what is like?
Show up at work, show up at, school, church, wherever that means for you to show up.
Yeah. And you mentioned this kind of idea of like needing to create maybe some boundaries that like give you the space in order to like handle some of these things. I'm curious, is that, and maybe the answer is all these things, is that like boundaries from people? Is that boundaries from the specific source of the pressure? What does that, like the idea of like creating boundaries look like?
I think like there's internal, external boundaries too that we're always striving to kind of understand and implement. Some of the internal boundaries can become really murky and enmeshed when we are really, really stressed out. And I mean that in a way that is, we tend to forget some of the reality and cognitive pieces of the truth, rather than what we tend to maybe more focus on our feelings. And feelings are valid, but they also are just feelings. They're not necessarily the truth, Yeah. And so when high anxiety comes and like depression comes, and when this comes, we kind of tend to say to ourselves, man, I'm really feeling these really, really bad feelings. That means I'm a bad person. That means I'm failing. This means that, I can't ever gonna, like, there's a lot that I can't handle. Like, it's kind of like sort of like listening to the feelings rather than cognitions.
Like
so the boundary, the boundary would be, well, what is the truth? So I couldn't maybe show up today at work or maybe this week, but what does that mean about myself? Does that mean that I'm a failure? No. That means maybe I need some care. Maybe I need attention. Maybe I need whatever that means.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like sort of revamping, like, I'm not going to listen to those feelings. I think they're kind of sort of a way to kind of create an alertness to where we're at, but it doesn't mean the truth.
Yeah.
So
That's
those
really,
boundaries get enmeshed.
yeah, that's really interesting. Historically, I've heard frequently, about the concept of like, yeah, creating boundaries with people that are in your life and maybe you're interacting with in like a challenging relationship or something, and like creating boundaries around that, or boundaries around like how much you're working or things like that. I think the idea of putting boundaries for yourself and like how, like, that's a really fascinating thing I haven't heard very many people like talking about. If I like if I was wanting to like, oh, I want to figure out what some of those boundaries like would be helpful for me. Do you have any advice for like what kind of process I might go through? Is there like questions I would start to ask myself? Was there, what could that process look like?
I think again, when you're feeling anxiety and shame, and sometimes like when you're butting up against people who also have issues, they might kind of project that on you.
Mm.
And so sometimes it's like, wow, that didn't feel good. And this situation doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
Identifying like, okay, one of the things that we kind of talk about a lot in our agency is this impacts me, but this is not about me.
Hmm.
So that can kind of start to sort of like reduce some of that, like what in this situation impacts me, but it's not about me. Because we take on all of it typically, like, wow, that person really reacted really horribly to me, or like my boss just screamed at me. Again, like, whoa, like, is this, and you could totally take that all on, like, what do I do? Oh my gosh, like, I need to repair this. I need to fix this. I need to do this. I need to do that. And it's like, well, pulling back and being like, where's my role in this? Can be helpful to say, this does impact me. It makes me feel really sad and frustrated, but that situation was not about me. So sometimes like you can put that for a context for like maybe a lot of things out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense, because I think that so frequently we can wrap our own identity or value into, so many different places, right? Whether that's work, whether that's being a parent, whether that's our friendships, whatever it is. And to create a space where, just because something negative happens, and I think you touched on it really well. I love that you mentioned it. Hey, those feelings are fair. Like, that's valid for you to feel that way. But don't internalize that more than is appropriate, or more than is accurate, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Awesome.
hard to do it, is especially with like family members, with like parents, if sometimes when parents have cultural weird obligations, or just sort of like this honing in on expectations that are passive aggressive towards you, like even just the sense of like people being passive aggressive, it's like that kind of makes you feel weird. And then you're like, what do I need to do? And sometimes it's like, I don't need to do anything. Like, that impacted me, but that definitely was not about me.
Yeah. So if you have a client that like maybe struggles with that and wants to, the phrase makes everything about them sounds bad. Cause I think that carries a different type of connotation with it, but, struggles to separate that. Is that where you encourage, hey, like, ask yourself those questions in those moments? Is that, would there be any strategy to do that well?
Well, that's like what we're talking about is like cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very general term to sort of separate our feelings from cognitions.
Gotcha.
And, it takes like an emotional capacity to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And to choose to be able to understand, like, okay, there's a truth here and there's a choice to believe in the truth. Where some clients really struggle in just completely honing in and encompassing all those feelings that is the truth, and they're stuck in that. They're stuck so hard in their feelings that it's really hard for them to even like think about, maybe my feelings aren't right here. Could that possibly be true? Am I loved? Well, I don't feel loved. And it's really hard for people to kind of to give themselves that grace and compassion for the perception of the other, of feeling loved when you don't feel loved. It's very hard to do.
Yeah. I'm curious. I imagine there's some people listening in and they're thinking, yeah, I'm not a super emotional person, and so I don't maybe necessarily like talking about like the feelings element, and I'm not sure if I fully engage with that. I mean, I have my own thoughts on that piece, but I'm curious if someone wouldn't necessarily identify as somebody who's like, yeah, maybe fully aware or has a hard time struggling, a hard time identifying the emotions that they're feeling. What would you say to them? What would your encouragement for them be?
Well, I don't think that people don't experience emotions, but I think that people have a hard time identifying what they are.
Yeah.
And so I just think that that takes a lot of like psychoeducation around naming that.
Hmm.
There's a lot of in the Midwest, it's very much like push everything under the rug. Everything's gonna be fine. We don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And so that is sort of like kind of like feelings 101. Like in this moment right now, how are you feeling? Well, I have no clue. Well, let's think about that for a second. And then I kind of have to hone in on where in your body are you feeling attention. And so I kind of have to holistically kind of go into this sense of where there's bodily sensations. Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it in your neck? Like, how is that coming out sideways, even if you're not necessarily knowing how to like put a feeling word to it?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think it sounds like part of the struggle is like just even naming, hey, there is an emotional reaction as much as we would love to like, as much as maybe you'd love to think, I don't have these strong emotions or whatever. I'm pretty stoic. Or it's like there is an emotional response. You just maybe not connecting with it. So I'm curious, are there any maybe general strategies? We kind of talked through some of these about in general, but are there any other like maybe strategies for dealing with pressure? And how would those vary depending on like the source of the pressure?
Mm-hmm. Well, recognizing our personal symptoms is key. I honestly think that. Again, that does take some internal perspective, emotional perspective taking. How is my body responding to stress? Well, that differs, again, like the whole list of panic attacks and substance abuse and anger issues, all those, however that means for you. Again, is it inhibiting my everyday functioning? If so, where do I find care in distress? Like, how do I find comfort in distress? Sometimes this can be with like your partner or with other people, but sometimes it really is finding a way that you need to comfort yourself in distress. Sometimes like basic things can be like, self-care of getting really good sleep, getting on a better diet regimen or meditation, deep breathing exercises, things like that, like that is drink more water, exercise, like do some yoga, like, that's like the very everyday thing. But let's say like you get to a point of massive burnout, where you're really not functioning well. You're not showing up. You're not sleeping. You have massive insomnia. You're just not yourself. Then there's a huge red flag where community members need to maybe come around you and loved ones to say, I think you need a higher level of care. And what does that look like?
Yeah.
So possibly seeing a therapist, possibly seeing your doctor for medication, some really skills building in the midst of that grief or burnout is necessary for it to get back sort of on track to feel yourself again.
Are there any tools that you'd recommend for, so let's say, I'll go specific. I think for a lot of people, one of the key like pressures they might feel, is like, I think you mentioned like the pressure to perform at like work. If somebody was talking to you, and you could probably equate this to work, school, whatever, some sort of essentially job-based thing, where it's like I feel like this pressure to do a good job or to provide in some situation. Somebody's sharing that with you. What would you like? Okay, let's try these things. What would you say?
Well, I think there's two things of like, what is healthy pressure too? What is motivate? Like, I think some pressure can be a really great motivator for change,
Yeah.
like the pressure to perform well in things that maybe you desire to attain your goals and fulfill your accomplishments. I think that there can be a healthy means of that pressure. And so maybe honing in on, okay, like what is realistic and unrealistic for you right now? And that's okay. Like we need to
Mm.
normalize like that you're trying your hardest, that
Yeah.
you are, a little bit at a time, like fulfilling some of those goals and you're reaching them. Like that is awesome. It could be a motivator for change. And I think the other disconnect is where we are inducing ourselves that sense of shame again, where that murkiness of I'm failing
Mm.
because I did this, I am not good enough, and deciphering where that is. And so, like, when you recognize that, first of all, it's like recognizing that shame. Where am I
Mm.
shitting myself over and over again? Where am I feeling not good enough? Is a powerful thing because then it's like, okay, I need to reconnect with myself.
Mm.
How do I reconnect with myself and find comfort in distress? And this means that a lot of times when we are feeling shame and the disconnect from ourselves, we need to strive in pulling into other relationships that replenish us, that give us that sense of love, again, to re-energize that and to pull us back onto the earth to say, you are loved, you are grounded, you are good enough. The relationships is a huge, powerful key also in our general stress.
Mm. It sounds I like the idea of like being able to like I think reconnect and like re-understand what almost like this reframing of what's most important and like your actual identity and your actual value. Because that's what it sounds like. It sounds like there's this like breakdown of like saying my value is based on XYZ and that's not being met, so I'm not valuable.
Right.
Um, which I mean, that's a hard thing to feel and overcome and face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And relationships are tricky, but I think another boundary is I'm going to hone in on the relationships that have a reciprocal role for myself,
Mm.
ones that really do provide me replenishing. And then, because I think a lot of us just like think like, oh, I'm going to go hang out. I'm going to get a drink, I'm going to go to the bar, whatever. But those ones tend to be depleting,
Mm.
that can kind of sort of induce this even more sense of shame of like, I'm just going out to sort of like, well, fine, you're going out and you're having a good time, and that may reduce some stress. But I'm talking about the relationships that you find fulfillment
Mm.
and reciprocal meaning and like sort of the same like levels of interest and maturity and beauty that you get to hone in on that together.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned earlier was this idea of how comparison kind of creates some of that pressure, and I don't know anybody alive that doesn't that doesn't have some sort of struggle with comparison. It's just so built into us. How uh, how do you like encourage people who are struggling with comparison?
That's so hard. I mean, everybody does. And I think like one of the things that we hone in on is like, you don't know their story,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
you don't know yours. And so I think that we sort of perceive that they're better in a way, or they have their stuff together more than us, or they're better at this stuff. Well, at the end of the day, we don't know what their story is and what they're struggling with. And so I think that that sort of general normalization of they're suffering too, and they are human as well. And
Mm.
so, how do we not make this about them? Like for whatever reason, like, let's hone in again and reconnect with ourselves. What are we good
Mm.
at? What are
Yeah.
our gifts and talents? What are the things that can be reinforced and do well? And at the things that like we struggle with, well, we need to like have some work in that, but that doesn't mean that we're a failure.
Yeah. Mm. That's really good. Well, that was part one of my conversation with Amber, and I really appreciated the conversation and the insights on internal versus external pressure. I mean, particularly the idea of having boundaries for yourself and how you think and talk about yourself. One thing I'll add to this conversation from a faith perspective is that Jesus is right there with you in the midst of what you're going through. Now, it may not always feel that way, but he is. And I'd encourage you to remember that you're not alone. Sometimes just reminding yourself of that can make a big difference. Now, next week, we have the second half of the conversation, and we talk through how to help your kids deal with the pressure that they face. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.